So for all of our viewers, I know everybody will be jumping on here and like, what the heck is happening? So we have Dr. Lindsey Wendt here with us. This was originally going to be on Facebook, so now we are here. But we just had her hop on here so we can just kind of pick her brain as a vet on pet food, raw, and how to pick proteins. She's owner and founder of Crystal Lotus Vet, and she's been in practice for over 10 years now, I believe. And so she is very well educated and she has all the answers. So drop some questions in the comments as we go along, but I'll kind of open up the floor to her for a little bit to kind of explain her and
perfect. Thank you everyone for bearing with us. But I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. And Lily and Northwest Naturals, thank you so much for creating this platform and providing such diets. So like Lily mentioned, I've been in practice for a little over 10 years now. I started in conventional medicine, and then I've slowly moved more and more into holistic medicine. So I actually kind of categorize myself as an integrative vet, meaning I still practice conventionally, kind of more standard general practice, but I also do a lot of holistic work. And as I've gotten more and more into holistic medicine, nutrition has become a huge platform and foundation of my practice, of my dog's life, of my own life. And I've really seen the major shifts in health that can occur when we just are able to pinpoint the proper nutrition. And I think one of the biggest kind of deficits in conventional medicine is the idea that, first of all, that kibble is the best option. I think we'll all agree that that is not true. This is a safe place, and I'm happy to answer any questions as to why I'm making that statement. But I'll start by saying overall, kibbles and processed foods are created in a actual way of called extrusion. And extrusion is a high pressure, high heat method of creating foods. And when that occurs, and when all of these amazing food materials go through that process, the nutrients are blasted out of them. And so what happens is at the end, you're actually adding on a lot of the nutrients that were present originally in those food items and now need to be replaced with synthetic items, which is obviously not ideal. So the idea of integrating in, diets such as Northwest Naturals that are offering high quality, raw, either freeze-dried or frozen options for a lot of our pets can help not only with diseases that they have, but also be preventative. I think that's the most important part, is not waiting until a disease comes up, actually trying to make proactive choices so that we don't have to deal with chronic disease down the line. We all want our pets to live and be with us as long as possible and live their healthiest lives. So just to start out, I thought I would talk a little bit about Chinese food therapy, because that's really one of my big focuses. And the beauty about Northwest Naturals, they have such a robust offering of proteins that it allows a true customization for you and your pet, whether it's a dog or cat. So Chinese food therapy is really the idea in which we look at the food ingredients, and they all have different properties associated with them. And one of the biggest is temperatures. And I think the easiest way that I explain this to humans, because we can all kind of relate to this, is on a hot summer day, usually the last thing you want to eat is lamb or venison. Even if you're eating those meats in a cold prepared way, they tend to generate a lot of heat within our bodies. The opposite is true, if it's the middle of winter, especially if you're in a place that has real seasons, unlike where I am in Los Angeles. You're not going to usually reach for cooling food. So things like watermelon, things like whitefish, or really more like just those items that are going to create a cooling effect, which is beautiful when you're in a warm climate, but you don't really crave those things when you're looking for warmth. And so when it comes to our pets, the idea of incorporating different temperatures of proteins especially can be very helpful, and ways of determining what protein is appropriate for your pet can depend on a lot of different aspects. So first of all, where do you live? Do you live somewhere where it's really hot and sunny most of the year? Do you live somewhere where you have seasons? And in that case, perhaps you rotate the proteins that you're feeding. When you're in the middle of summer and it's hot, you may not want to feed lamb and venison, but if it's snowing and freezing outside, that might be a good time to move to a protein like that. Vice versa, when it's summer, feeding a cooling food can be almost your nourishing and comforting for a lot of our pets. And then beyond the environmental temperatures that they're living in, also is almost their internal temperature. And what I mean by that is there are some health conditions that will generate certain temperatures within their body. So for example, I know one person had asked about Cushing's. Cushing's is a disease that generates a lot of heat. And so when we have a dog that has Cushing's, we really want to try to focus on protein that will help to cool them off. So our goal is always try to bring a neutral place. So really when we're talking about temperatures, there's 5 in general. There's hot, there's kind of a spectrum. There's hot, warm, neutral, cool, and cold. For a lot of animals, when I'm taking a history, for example, I'll ask people, does your dog or cat love to bask in the sun? Or are they seeking out cool tile to lay on and feel comforted by? And that can actually help guide as well, because if your dog or cat is constantly seeking out a cooling surface, I'm not going to recommend that you feed a hot protein because they're already telling us that they need more cooling in their body. So that's an animal that could do really well with rabbit, could do really well with turkey or whitefish or duck. So the opposite is true. If they're huge sunbathers, sometimes they just love the sun. So we have to take that into consideration. But a lot of times it's because they're seeking out heat. And this is really true for some of our older animals. So one of the classic examples I like to give people are older kitties. You know, they tend to get arthritic. They are a little stiff. And a lot of people will notice that when it's colder outside, a lot of those arthritic animals and humans will have more trouble. So if we can add warmer proteins into their diet, so things like lamb, chicken, salmon, even trout, it can help to internally give them warmth and can actually help their mobility, in addition to supplements and other beautiful things that we can include. One other kind of fun way of looking at the proteins is in traditional Chinese medicine, we talk about a 5-element theory. And I could spend an hour talking about that alone, so I'll make it really brief in that they're basically constitutions or personality types. And so depending on what constitution or personality type your animal is, sometimes you'll feed for that constitution. A good example is a Pomeranian. They tend to be very vocal, want to be the center of attention, life of the party. And so in Chinese medicine or 5-element theory, that's a fire personality. So a lot of times when we're looking to support them, and a lot of the diseases that they will be subject to are related to that organ system, and that organ system for fire, for example, is heart. So things like anxiety, things like heart disease, we may want to look for proteins that help to actually support those specific organs, which I know is very different from the Western way of nutrition, but is also something that can help not only with a disease if they currently have been diagnosed, but also in prevention. So it's kind of it's a different approach and a different way of looking at things, but can really help us customize in a very, very different way. So in terms of the proteins, I wanted to just go through some of them, especially because, like I mentioned, Northwest Naturals offers so many different proteins that it allows a lot of customization. And I always tell people, you know, I actually encourage rotating proteins in a safe manner. So what I usually tell people is, you know, start with one, feed it for anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks, monitor their response to it, and then you'll basically have a list of no's. When you are determining, yep, this is a protein that's safe, that means that your animal is not developing vomit or diarrhea or itchy skin or any other negative change that, of course, we're trying to avoid. On the flip side of that, if you were to try a new protein, and ideally you always want to slowly mix those proteins together for about 7 to 10 days to allow their intestinal tract to adjust to the new proteins that need to be broken down. But when you're doing that, if you notice, oh, my cat just got really itchy, or my dog developed diarrhea about 5 days later, that may be a sign that that protein is not a good fit. Now, what's very interesting and very different is in Western medicine, we would call that food allergy. But what a lot of people notice, not actually the protein itself, it's actually the temperature that the protein is bringing into play. So if your animal is already hot, if you add a hot protein, or for example, if your animal has intestinal disease, like inflammatory bowel disease, like my little girl does, she does not do really well on hot proteins because they add more heat to her system, and then that leads to some side effects. So we tend to go for more neutral or cooling proteins for her. Now, in terms of the proteins themselves, so I'm going to lump beef and bison together because they are very similar, but beef and bison tend to be neutral proteins, meaning if your pet is not really showing a huge preference for heat versus cool, if you're just approaching things from a preventative angle, these are two proteins that I actually really like. They are both blood tonics, meaning they help to enrich the blood system, which is not only a treatment for anemia, kind of what we all think of as a classic blood loss, but can actually be really helpful for dry skin. It can be helpful for anxiety because it helps to kind of cool the mind, the heart, and this gets a little complicated, but the heart is actually responsible for anxiety in Chinese medicine. So the more blood support that we can give, the more beneficial that is. In general, beef especially really helps to tonify qi or life energy as well. So that is it's one of my favorite proteins. So definitely a huge fan of beef and bison. Chicken, because that's a common one. And I know a lot of people talk about chicken being a common allergen. I'm not going to say that that isn't true, but the other really interesting thing about chicken is it's a warm protein. So if your animal is already suffering from allergies, for example, especially skin allergies, if you add warmth into that equation, oftentimes you will notice worsening of itching. So it's not necessarily that there's an allergy to the chicken itself, and usually allergies are derived from an immune response to the protein segment itself. But what's actually happening is the warmth from the protein is causing that itchiness. So the other thing I would lump into that category would be salmon, because that's another warm protein, and lamb, which is hot. So for example, if your animal has allergies, you may actually want to look at rabbit or duck or turkey. Those are usually my top three. Depending on whether they are a heat or a cool seeker, you may want to actually go for something neutral, like whitefish, because that could be another good option, or back to beef and bison. And again, you want to try one thing at a time and then monitor their individual response. The lovely thing about chicken is a very strong qi or energy tonic. So for a lot of because I practice with a lot of geriatric animals, a lot of my practice is revolved around palliative and end-of-life care. I love chicken for a lot of them. It's feeding their kidney qi specifically, and kidneys in Chinese medicine are responsible for our joints, arthritis, and also kidney function itself, which a lot of us know. Kidneys, as animals get older, tend to have decreased function. So we want to try to support them as much as we possibly can. One other fun fact, in terms of senses, your kidneys are responsible for your hearing, which I know is very kind of challenging for us to understand, but it's true. So let's say you are concerned about your dog starting to have some hearing loss. Try one of the chicken-based diets instead and see if you're able to, by integrating that in, support that organ system a little bit more specifically. So next is duck. Duck is a cooling protein. So that means that, again, if we're dealing with allergies, this is a great option. If you live in a really hot area or during summer, duck is a good go-to. And duck in particular is really powerful at tonifying yin. And here's another part of Chinese medicine. So it's a little bit of a mix for this conversation, but yin and yang, which I think most of us know about, really constitutes the balance of our bodies. So yang is very kind of powerful, strong. It's related more to heat. Yin is what we like to call the internal air conditioner. So for example, as animals get older, or animals that are on steroids, or animals that have Cushing's, which is an excess production of their own internal steroid, you may notice that they're drinking more water at night. They're panting more at night. They're restless at night. And a lot of times that can actually be secondary to a yin deficiency. So if we're able to supplement or switch them to a diet, especially a duck-based diet, that cooling protein is going to help over time to bring them back into a state of balance or homeostasis. The other kind of side I should start with, and I should have started with, so I apologize, is raw foods in general are cooling. So that's also an important thing to take into account, because I know not everyone is going to feed 100% raw. A lot of people like to kind of mix and match, and that's great. You just want to remember that kibble in general is very, very hot. Raw foods are cooling. So when you're trying to balance those things out, just try to take that into account. So if your pet is having issues with heat, it's a really good reason to get them onto raw, and you may not have to go to a raw cooling diet right off the bat. You may be able to start with a raw neutral diet, like beef or bison, or trout, because trout is neutral to warming. So next is lamb. Lamb is a hot protein, but again, because we're feeding raw lamb, if anything, and I hate to categorize it as warm versus hot in this case, but it's probably somewhere floating in between. So let's say that there's other reasons for us wanting to choose lamb. Like it's a great support for the kidneys, it's a great support for the heart, and it's a great support for the spleen. Three major organs that we oftentimes end up treating medically with different disorders as pets get older. So example, the spleen in Chinese medicine is responsible for digestion. So when we're talking about digestion, we all think of the pancreas. The pancreas and the spleen are kind of synonymous when we talk about Chinese medicine. So if your animal suffers from pancreatitis, for example, or inflammatory bowel disease, you're going to want to support the spleen. If your dog has heart disease or has anxiety, you want to support the heart. And then if your dog has kidney disease or arthritis, you want to actually support the kidneys. So that's where you can use a little bit of balance, and it's a bit of an art in a way. And we do have something to help you guys that we'll talk about at the end of this with that, because I know it's a lot of information, but you can really just adjust to your individual. And I think that's the most important thing. I'll probably say that over and over because it's really important to me. It's my mantra. So next protein is rabbit. Rabbit, like I mentioned, is a cooling protein, and it's actually a sweet protein. And with the 5 sort of tastes or senses, sweet actually feeds the spleen. So again, that's helpful for digestion. So let's say you have a dog or a cat that's living in a hotter climate, and you want to offer something that's going to support their digestion and also give them some cooling. Rabbit could be a really great option. Rabbit also tonifies qi, or the whole body energy, as well as yin, like we talked about, that internal air conditioner. So it really checks a lot of boxes, actually. Rabbit is definitely one of my favorites, and Northwest Naturals is great about providing that for us. Next is salmon. So salmon is a warming protein. So in general, again, kind of going back to why would we choose salmon? This may not be my go-to for normally for a dog that has allergies, but because we're feeding a raw-based salmon diet, this actually could be a helpful diet for dogs that have allergies. And that's very, very different from a recommendation I would make if someone was feeding a gently cooked or a more processed food, because that salmon's going to be warm then. But by feeding raw, we're able to bring that back to a sort of a cooler spot, which is nice. Trout, like I mentioned, is neutral to warming. So it depends a lot on where the trout is raised, which I know also sounds a little bit funny, but it's true. All those things matter. Turkey is a cooling protein and is a really great one. So it's good at tonifying yin. So again, that internal air conditioner. Turkey specifically supports the kidney, the liver, the spleen, and the stomach. So with the spleen and the stomach combined, we have a lot of GI support. So a lot of people will notice that if their pets have a little bit of intestinal sensitivity or diet sensitivity, turkey is a great option. It's a really, really good one. So in general, GI issues, kidney disease, or that yin deficiency that I talked about. So, having issues settling at night, drinking a lot at night, turkey is a great option to start integrating in. And then lastly is whitefish. So whitefish is more of a neutral temperature. And again, it's a sweet protein. So good for spleen and stomach. Also helpful for the liver and the lung, which I know we haven't talked much about the lung, but the lung in Chinese medicine is actually associated with the immune system. And so the internal kind of screening that our lungs are doing constantly in Chinese medicine is extended to our outer surface as well. So if you do have a pet that has bronchitis or has allergies, because allergies are so common, so that's why I keep bringing that up. A lot of us have to go through trials and tribulations to find a diet that works. Whitefish could be a really good option for them. Now, the beautiful thing about Northwest Naturals as well is the combinations of the proteins, right? That's where it gets kind of fun. So we have our straightforward ones, like beef is neutral. Beef and bison, definitely neutral. But then we get to beef and trout. So if beef is neutral and trout is neutral to warming, we would put that in sort of a neutral to slightly warming. So it gives us, again, a little bit of variability and customization in terms of options. Chicken being warm, chicken and salmon together would be warm. Lamb is hot, turkey is cool, down that same diet about. So that is the overview, at least, I wanted to touch on, and I'm sorry that ended up being a little bit more rushed because of the technical difficulties with being angry with me. But I see that there's a lot of questions coming through. So you want to facilitate some of those for us?
Yes, I feel like I've learned a lot. This has been great. I love this. Okay, so yes, there has been quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to kind of rapid fire them to you, okay? So what proteins do you recommend for a cat with urinary issues? Proteins to stay away from. They eat
Okay,
raw
so
and
I
wet
love that
canned.
you're feeding raw and wet canned. So this is a good point to bring up is any animal that has urinary issues, the more moisture, the better. So we want to avoid dry foods altogether. And even what I would do is with the freeze-dried raw, I would actually add water to it if you just give them extra moisture in any possible way. Now, in terms of proteins, because we want to increase the moisture in their body, and again, it depends on the urinary issue, because usually urinary issues, if we're talking about inflammation, that's a heat-based problem, right? So I would go for duck, because not only is that a cooling protein, but it tonifies yin, which is that internal air conditioning system. I would go for rabbit, or I would go for turkey in those cases. Or feel free to rotate between them safely.
Awesome. Okay, next up, do you have any proteins you suggest for a dog that is suffering with high liver values or bladder issues?
So liver, this is actually a really good point. Thank you for this question. One other concept that I didn't talk about, and this is very foreign, but if you have an issue with an organ, feeding that protein, supporting the health of that organ. So if your pet, and I'm sorry that your pet has liver issues, because I know that is tough. If your pet has liver issues, beef liver treats. So these are actually perfect. Beef is a neutral protein. Beef actually supports the liver, and we're feeding liver. So we're kind of checking 3 boxes there. In terms of the urinary support, the kidney and the bladder are a pair in Chinese medicine. So if we have bladder issues, and this also loops in our past question, we do want to try to support the kidney. So in that case, I would go for duck. I would go for turkey again. It's just, unfortunately, it was kind of hit over and over again. And then salmon's another good one. That's a kidney supporter. And then chicken as well.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so goji berries and dried Chinese yams.
I love goji berries.
Recommend those?
So in medicine, those are called lycium, and they're considered almost like a longevity fruit, which I think it is on the human side as well. So that's probably easy for all of us to accept. My biggest thing about feeding any sort of new food item like that is one thing at a time and just a little bit, right? We just want to introduce a little bit, kind of sprinkle it on top as something fun to add. But I love goji berries. My dog eats them all the time. We share. And then yam. Yeah, so like purple yam. That's another really good one. So yams are a very good spleen qi tonic. So great for digestion. I actually recommend boiling them instead of baking them. The reason for that is when you boil sweet potatoes, it actually, which I'm going to put the Chinese yam in there with that, it helps to retain more moisture. So it serves as more of a yin tonic. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then what about for thyroid? For low thyroid, do you have any suggestions to stay away from or to maybe implement?
So thyroid disease in particular, a lot of times they end up yin. Sorry, I'm thinking about this at the beginning. So I would go for a yin tonic agent. And the other thing that most people usually notice with hypothyroidism is those dogs run really hot. So they are laying on cool floors. They're sitting right by the air conditioner. So again, we want either a yin, or if we can get both, yin tonification, and we want cooling. So going back to the duck, rabbit, turkey combo. They're 3 good ones because cooling proteins are really helpful. Most of the diseases that we deal with ongoing tend to be inflammatory, and so those are heat.
Perfect. Okay. And then can you touch on preferred feeding times like morning, afternoon, evening, and the amount of feeding per day with dogs and cats? Yeah. Obviously, it's a little bit personal, but in general.
Studies show that ideally eating once a day may actually promote longevity. So in an ideal world with a healthy animal that can tolerate that, and I'll get back to that in a second, I would recommend feeding a day. I prefer to feed in the morning. The reason for that is another beautiful aspect of Chinese medicine is the association with times of day. So the digestive system tends to be the most open in the morning, which I know is a little counterintuitive from a lot of Western ways of approaching dieting and eating. But ideally, feeding them in the morning would be ideal. And then that way they go through the day, they burn their calories, and then they fast overnight. Now, there are some pets that cannot tolerate fasting for that long. And that's usually because they have internal heat. So like stomach heat, for example. And in that case, I would recommend feeding, and it's going to depend a little bit on your personal kiddo, but either 2 to 3 times a day. A lot of times with intestinal disease, smaller, more frequent meals is actually easier for them to break down and digest. So you don't want to throw a lot of food into the pot that needs to be cooked down. You want to give them small little allotments at a time.
Perfect. Okay. And then what about rotating proteins? And is it okay
Definitely.
to
That's a
stay in the
great
same
question.
brand?
So again, if you're tolerate it, because every kid is different, rotating a beautiful thing. That way it's variety, the spice of life, right? We get a little bit of everything. So maybe we feed a kidney chi tonic for a month, and then we focus more on a heart energy tonic, or we rotate through the seasons like we talked about. So maybe we feed some more warming to hot proteins in the winter, and then we go to cooling to neutral in the summer. And that's really, if anything, just gives more diversity also to their microbiome. And that's another thing that I'm borderline obsessed with, so I won't go too crazy, but the microbiome is the population of microorganisms that live in our pet's large intestines. The more is becoming very, very clear that when we eat and when we feed our pets, we are feeding the microbiome 100%. It's making a lot of our neurotransmitters. It determines what kind of food we crave. So rotation is a beautiful way of keeping a nice, robust microbiome. And staying in the same brand, as long as it's a highly trusted brand, I think it's actually ideal.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay. And then Nala was getting ear infections on chicken food, but then switched to lamb, but they're both hot. Do you have maybe any ideas of why that switch?
Yeah, so
could
getting
have done
ear
that?
infections on chicken, but then lamb resolved it. So in that case, there might have actually been a chicken allergy. So, and that's possible.
Yeah.
That definitely happens. The other thing I have found as well is it's not just the proteins in the food, it's the other ingredients. There might have been some other ingredient within that chicken diet that was inciting the allergy. And so it was less about the thermal properties and more about the individual ingredient itself.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. And then this person mentioned mixing raw and kibble, that they've heard that you can, and sometimes they've heard that they can't.
I don't have an issue with
mixing.
If anything, the common concern is that they're processed so differently within their bodies in terms of kibble is so high in carbohydrates. So any kibble is at least 40% carbs. And then obviously when we're talking about raw diets, we're talking minimal to no carbohydrates. So the enzymes that are needed for that are a little bit different. I know that, just to be very honest, I understand that raw foods are expensive, but the other way of thinking about this, and even what I tell myself and my clients, is it's investing in their health for the future. So as much as you can try to find a balance, I say do it. The other thing I will say is if you are going to feed or include some kind of kibble, try to search out a baked kibble instead of extruded. It's hard to find, but they do exist, and it will just help to elevate the nutritional care in general.
Love that. Okay, awesome. And then this person was asking for food for when they go out and traveling and stuff for raw. And I know that we have our raw frozen, which is most people's oh, when it's raw, it's frozen. We also have our freeze dried. It's the exact, it's the exact same recipe as freeze dried. So it's not frozen. So that one's good for that.
That's
Do you have any
wonderful
thoughts
thing
on
about
that?
it is you can mix and match. So stay at home, even if you wanted to feed the frozen raw, defrosted, actually go the whole thing, wonderful. Otherwise, you can do freeze dried raw, and then it's super convenient. Just take it with you as you go, use it as treats.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, and then what about proteins that may help gain
proteins
weight?
to help gain weight. It depends a bit on the underlying issue as to why they're having weight gain problems. So oftentimes weight loss is associated with the spleen organ. So again, going back to digestion. So in that case, we may actually want to focus on a spleen tonic. It depends a little bit on some of the other properties, but good spleen tonics would be beef and bison, chicken, salmon, rabbit. Actually, a lot of them. A lot of the proteins that you guys have are spleen chi tonics. So I would say chicken is a really strong one. Chicken and beef combo would be great, or alternating.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, and
Yes.
then what
So
about
heart
heart
health,
health?
with the heart in general, again, which I don't think I showed this one over too. They all take. So
Heart.
this is if
Yes.
your dog has anxiety or if your dog has heart disease, one really easy way to support them is by being conscious about the treats that we're providing. And feeding an organ meat based treat, especially a heart based organ meat treat, is a beautiful way of supporting their heart health.
Perfect. Okay, and then let's see. For asthma and
Okay.
cats, they love chicken and do a little duck. Do you
I
have better
love duck
protein
for
for
that.
asthma?
So a lung chi tonic.
Okay.
Whitefish would be another one. So even the whitefish salmon combo for cats would be a good one. Turkey is really lung driven and neither is rabbit. So I would say the whitefish and salmon would probably actually be my top recommendation, or the duck.
Perfect. Okay. And then do you have like suggestions for feeding raw? Maybe I can touch on this a little
Yeah.
bit,
If
but
you,
like
you
safe
want to, yeah, please go for
handling.
it. Because I feel like
Like,
this, yeah.
yeah. So now this question's kind of general because it was like, what raw is the safest? Because I know handling raw food can be a little bit scary sometimes. And the great thing about our packaging is that it's super easy to pour just straight from the bag and reseal, so you don't have to touch the product at all. And so that's kind of the freeze dried is why I love that so much, is because you can take it on the go with you, like throw it in a backpack when you're traveling. And it's super easy just to pour right from the bag. So let's see. Is the frozen or freeze dried more beneficial, or
I
are they
think
about
it
the same?
depends on whatever's easiest for you lifestyle wise. If anything, the frozen raw would be, I would think, a bit higher in moisture, right? Because it's not freeze dried, but you can always
Mhm.
add water to the freeze dry and increase the moisture content. So you have that flexibility.
Yep. Okay, awesome. I think I've gotten most of the questions. Um, do you do any virtual consultations? Because I know you're in
I do. So I
LA.
do nutrition and diet consultations virtually. So you can actually visit my website. It's www.crystallotusvet.com. And you can go on there and send us a message, and my assistant and I will reach out to you and see how we can help.
Perfect. Okay, I just saw another question on here. What are the best proteins for giant
Hmm.
breeds?
You know,
Health.
I wouldn't necessarily say there's a different protein just because of their breed, but it depending on what issues they're as a breed they're prone to would probably be the better way of choosing. So in general, when we talk about giant breed dogs, we're usually thinking about joint disease. So in general, I would focus more
Yeah.
on kidney chi tonics. So again, temperature dependent.
Mm.
We're talking, I mean, chicken is probably the strongest one out of those as well, or lamb.
Yeah.
So it depends. You get a warm, a hot, or a kind of cool option out of.
Yeah. Okay, last question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Kidney health. Do you recommend
Okay,
different
so
proteins
this
for
is where I'm going
kidney
to make
problems?
most of your conventional veterinarians upset. um,
Love
yes, you're
that.
supposed to reduce protein. From a Chinese medicine perspective, I do not do that until they get to a certain degree of kidney disease. The reason for that being, one of the biggest complications and poor prognostic factors for animals with kidney disease, dogs or cats, is muscle loss. And so when we're feeding them these low protein diets, I have actually seen animals do so much better feeding kidney chi tonic diets. So instead of restricting the workload of the kidney, why not build up the energy of the kidney, both with food, Chinese herb supplements? You know, there's so many ways of doing that, acupuncture as well. But until they get to a certain level of kidney disease, I actually do not recommend protein restricting. The Western side of nutrition is starting to come around to this. So some of the prescription diets are starting to make early kidney care diets that are phosphorus restricted, because that is somewhat important once you get up to a certain level of phosphorus. That's probably the more important determining factor than the protein itself. So that's a great question. It is case dependent, but I would not say across the board. Like if your veterinarian tells you your animal was just diagnosed with kidney disease, please find a resource that can help you choose the right diet.
For sure. Awesome. Well, I know that this was a little bit technical difficulties here at the beginning, but you did an amazing job. I feel like I learned so much,
Sure.
so thank you for taking the time. I'll let you kind of close off too with your website one more time so people can find you. But I will be posting some more resources for everybody on our Facebook and also some links on our Instagram story. We have an awesome PDF to break down everything that Lindsey just talked about and break it down for you. And then also a quiz so you can go and take a personalized quiz to figure out what proteins work best for your dog and your cat. So,
Thank
Lindsey,
you
if you want to close
so
off
much,
here,
Lily.
it
Yeah,
was
so
great
Lily and I
having
worked
you.
really hard actually to make this quiz. Lily did most of it. I just provided her the information, but I know this was a lot of information that we talked about. So the nice thing about the quiz is you can just go on, answer the questions, and then you will get a very clear direction in which way you should head and what's personally good for your pet. And the other thing about that is that will evolve over time, right? So you may want to check in and retake that quiz every quarter and see, okay, maybe now we need to incorporate a cooling protein. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I always love when people are interested about learning about nutrition, which is great. My website is www.crystallotusvet.com. My Instagram handle is crystallotusvet. And yeah, if there's anything we can do to help, please let us know. And I wish all of you happy, healthy rest of this year. Thanks,
Awesome.
Lily.
Thank you,
Everyone,
Lindsey.
take
Thank you,
care.
everybody.